There are concerts you remember, and then there are nights that seem to carry an entire lifetime inside them. Toronto was always going to be different for Rush. This is the city where the story began, where Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson grew from young musicians into two of rock's most enduring figures. So when Rush returned to their hometown, the meaning reached beyond a set list. For longtime fans, every note carried history. And then came the phrase that caught attention: words fail me. It is important to treat those words as a reported statement, not as a window into thoughts we cannot know. The phrase captures the weight of a homecoming like this. Rush is no longer simply revisiting the past. Geddy and Alex are standing before generations of listeners who have carried their music for decades. Behind them is a remarkable legacy. Beside them is a new chapter, with Anika Nilles bringing her own voice to the drum seat, and in front of them is Toronto, where so much began. It mattered. Toronto has always been more than a location on the Rush map. It is part of the band's identity. From the early days of small venues to arenas filled with devoted fans, the city watched the journey unfold. That history made this return feel unusually personal. For the audience, the emotion was not simply about hearing familiar songs again. It was about seeing Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson together on a Toronto stage, carrying forward a partnership that has survived decades of change, triumph, loss, and uncertainty. Their presence connected the present to the Rush story fans remember. But this chapter sounds different. With Anika Nilles behind the drums, the music carries new energy while respecting the architecture created by Rush. She is not there to erase the past. She is helping the surviving members explore what the band can sound like now. That balance between memory and renewal made Toronto powerful. Every familiar melody could summon another era. Every new performance could remind fans that Rush's story is still moving tonight. And perhaps that is why the emotion in Toronto felt so powerful. Rush has never been only about spectacle. For many fans, the band became part of the soundtrack of their lives. Albums were discovered in bedrooms, cars, record stores, and late-night listening sessions. Songs grew alongside the people who loved them. A Rush concert could therefore feel like a reunion with an earlier version of yourself. Toronto intensified that feeling. This was not simply another stop on a tour. It was a return to the city that helped shape the band's identity. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson were standing before an audience that understood the history behind every chord. They knew what Rush had been, and they understood how much had changed. That makes the reported words fail me moment especially meaningful without requiring us to invent what Geddy was thinking. Sometimes a few words are enough because the setting says the rest. Decades of music, friendship, and memories were already in the room. And with Anika Nilles bringing a new rhythmic voice to the stage, the night also pointed forward. Rush was honoring its history while creating another memory for fans to carry home. The emotional weight was also in the contrast. Rush's history is inseparable from Neil Peart, whose musicianship and partnership with Geddy and Alex shaped generations of progressive rock fans. His absence changed the meaning of any future Rush performance. That is why Anika Nilles' presence matters. She is not stepping into a role that can simply be copied. She brings her own technique, personality, and musical instincts to material that has become sacred to millions. For longtime fans, watching that transition can be complicated. There is nostalgia, admiration, and perhaps even a quiet sense of disbelief. Yet Toronto offered something important, a chance to hear these songs live again, while acknowledging that time has moved forward. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson have spent decades building a musical language that remains unmistakable. Their return does not erase the past. It adds another chapter. And in a city so deeply connected to their story, that chapter carries unusual emotional force. The audience was not merely witnessing musicians perform, they were witnessing history continue in real time with all the memories that came with it. As the night moved forward, the significance became harder to separate from the music itself. A familiar bass line, a guitar phrase, or the sound of Geddy's voice could suddenly connect decades of Rush history to one moment in Toronto. That is what makes certain concerts stay with people. The performance ends, the lights come up, and yet the feeling refuses to disappear. For Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, returning to Toronto carried a meaning that cannot be reduced to numbers, ticket sales, or another entry on a tour schedule. This is home territory. It is where their musical journey took shape and where generations of fans learned to recognize the ambition, precision, and individuality that made Rush unique. Anika Nilles adds another dimension to that story. Her musicianship allows the songs to breathe in a new era while keeping the focus on the music itself. For fans, that can be both emotional and inspiring. The past remains present, but it does not have to become a prison. And perhaps that is the real power of this Toronto moment. Rush is remembering where it came from, while showing that its music can still create something new. By the end, Toronto meant more than one song. It became a meeting point between memory and the present, between the rush that changed progressive rock and the rush still finding its way forward. Geddy Lee and Lifeson have carried this story for decades through music, loss, and a changing rock world. Seeing them together again gave fans a living connection to the history they celebrated. The reported words fail me, resonate because sometimes emotion needs no long explanation. The city, audience, songs, and history speak enough. With Anika Nilles shaping this chapter, Rush's legacy is not being placed behind glass. It is being respected and carried forward. But perhaps the deepest meaning of Toronto was not simply that Rush had returned. It was that the audience understood exactly what that return represented. These fans had lived with the music through different stages of their own lives. They had watched the band evolve, watched the world around it change, and experienced the silence that followed the end of an era. Now, standing together again in Toronto, they were given something incredibly rare, another shared memory. Geddy Lee and Lifeson did not need to recreate the past perfectly. They only needed to step onto the stage and let the music speak. And with Anika Nilles bringing her own extraordinary musicianship into the picture, that music could move forward without forgetting where it came from. That is why the reported words fail me sentiment carries such weight. It reflects the kind of moment where explanation becomes smaller than the experience itself. Toronto was not just another concert city. It was a place filled with history, memories, and people who understood what Rush meant. For longtime fans, that may be what makes this chapter so unforgettable. Rush's story has always been about pushing forward while honoring the road behind them. And in Toronto, that journey felt closer than ever. And when the final notes faded, the most important part of the night may have been what remained after the music stopped. Toronto had witnessed another chapter in a story that began decades ago, when Geddy Lee and Lifeson were young musicians building something they could not yet have imagined would become legendary. For the fans, those memories were personal. Some had discovered Rush through records handed down by friends. Others grew up with the band as the soundtrack to entire chapters of their lives. Seeing that music return to Toronto could feel like meeting an old friend again, while also realizing just how much time had passed. That is what makes this moment different. It is not simply about recreating yesterday. It is about acknowledging yesterday while having the courage to continue. If you have followed Rush for decades, tell us what this Toronto return meant to you. For fans, that may be the greatest takeaway. The past cannot be repeated, but it can be honored. Memories can stand beside old ones. Toronto became part of that story again. If this moved you, subscribe and join our community of dedicated Rush and classic rock fans. The music changes, the legacy lives on, always too.